tarde a todos.
Boa tarde.
Todos me escutam? Sim, né? Obrigado pela presença. Mais um encontro do Tiaços. Hoje é um encontro bastante especial. Antes da gente poder apresentar o nosso convidado, queria fazer uma espécie de resumo do Tiaços até então. O Tiaços tem se orientado por um desejo meu e da Luciana Ximenes, junto com a nossa querida Isa, a tradutora, de apresentar para o público junguiano brasileiro, ou pelo menos encurtar a distância entre o mundo junguiano contemporâneo e a comunidade junguiana brasileira. Democratizar esse espaço, tornar acessível a todos nós estarmos juntos com grandes pensadores do campo junguiano. Isso foi o que nos orientou ao longo desses 3 anos. Seguindo essa diretriz, nós tivemos aqui a intenção de apresentar o quão múltiplo e variado é o campo junguiano. Então, nós tivemos pensadores como Murray Stein, Verena Cast, nós tivemos pensadores da escola arquetípica, como Patricia Berry, Ginette Paris, Stanton Marlan, Edward Cayce. Nós tivemos Wolfgang Gigris, aqui numa aparição bastante peculiar, Greg Mogenson. Foram muitos os convidados, Andrew Samuels, Mark Saban, e também todos os nossos queridos amigos brasileiros, Carmen Lívia Parisi, André Dantas, Guilherme Scandiuti, Maurício Santos e tantos outros, Luciana Schmernes. Mas hoje a gente tem um convidado especial que eu diria que é um personagem do campo junguiano que a gente poderia chamar de uma unanimidade, pelo respeito das suas obras, pela qualidade dos seus escritos, pela sua experiência. Então, de alguma maneira, para nós hoje, Tiaços recebe com muito carinho e com muita alegria e com bastante honrados dele ter aceito o nosso convite, o analista junguiano James Hollis. Eu vou apresentar o James Hollis da forma mais formal. James Hollis é analista junguiano com treinamento realizado em Zurique e com prática clínica em Washington. Ele é autor de 19 livros que foram traduzidos para 20 idiomas. Um analista internacionalmente aclamado, ele é ex-diretor executivo do Centro Educacional Jung de Houston. Seus livros incluem Projeto Éden, Em Busca do Outro Mágico, Encontrando Significado na Segunda Metade da Vida, O que Mais Importa, Vivendo uma Vida Mais Ponderada, A Passagem do Meio, da Miséria ao Significado na Meia-Idade, Assombrações, Dissipando os Fantasmas que Dirigem Nossas Vidas, Mitologemas, Encarnações do Mundo Invisível, Vivendo uma Vida Examinada, Sabedoria para a Segunda Metade da Jornada, e seus livros mais recentes são Vivendo Entre Mundos, Encontrando Resiliência Pessoal em Tempos de Mudança, e Primas, Reflexões sobre esta jornada que chamamos de vida. Para nossa sorte, há uma imensa parte da obra do James Hollis está traduzida para o português, né? Eu trouxe alguns: Sob a Sombra de Saturno, A Ferida e a Cura dos Homens, A Passagem do Meio, Da Miséria ao Significado de Nossas Vidas, e Assombrações, Dissipando os Fantasmas que Dirigem Nossas Vidas. Talvez não seja exagero dizer que o James é um dos autores junguianos mais traduzidos para o português. Por isso também a nossa alegria em poder tê-los aqui conosco. James, obrigado pela sua presença, obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite. A gente tem conversado, acho que desde o ano passado, né? Já havia feito o convite outras vezes e por uma série de impossibilidades não pôde acontecer, mas agora quiseram os deuses e deusas que isso fosse possível. Te agradeço a tua generosidade de nos receber, de vir até aqui. Seja bem-vindo, a casa é toda sua. A palavra é toda tua.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you this afternoon. I've had 2 visits to Brazil. Some of you may have been present, and we met before. They were wonderful visits and enormous hospitality, and I carry the warmest of memories of my times in Brazil. In addition, for the last almost half century, I've spent my life engaged in education, particularly trying to share some of the insights of Jung and analytic psychology with the general public. Rather than write to colleagues, I've been writing to the public all these years. And my feeling was, if I found something was useful for me, why would I not want to share that with others? So it was in that spirit that I've spent all of this time trying to take the complexities of Jung and make them available to ordinary people, such as myself, in order to be able to facilitate our individual journeys all the better. I wanted to begin before my main topic today, which is happiness, with a short poem by Wendell Berry called Our Real Work. And it's very short, but I want to read it twice because I want the meaning of it to percolate through our psychic layers. Our real work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have to come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Again, let me repeat this poem. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Well, in my own life, and probably the life of many others, it was because we reached those points where we knew not where to go, where the next step was not clear for us, that we first began to turn to the insights of analytic psychology. So I'm so happy today to be able to share with you some reflections on Jungian topics, and of course, respond to your comments and questions later. But to indicate my full support of the work of Theos, to be able to address the questions that haunt the modern soul, and to say Jung has been here before us. He's reflected on these matters, has a great deal to say, not in worship to Jung's thought and person, quite the contrary, but to free us to our own individual journeys. Earlier this summer, I was assigned the topic for another conference to speak on happiness. And ironically, I'd never written on the subject before, never particularly thought about it in a direct way. And I found myself not liking the subject. It's not that I'm against happiness. I found it kind of sort of problematic to reflect upon. So I'd like to share the notes that I wrote for that talk on happiness. And its subtitle is a line from a poet that Jack Prodakowski, who wrote once, "Find what you love and let it kill you. Find what you love and let it kill you." And in beginning, I want to again read a poem by Jack Gilbert, and it's called A Brief for the Defense. Sorrow everywhere. Slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else, with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. The Bengal tiger would not be fashioned so miraculously well. The poor women at the fountain are laughing together between the suffering they have known and the awfulness of their future. smiling and laughing while somebody in the village is very sick. There's laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta, and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure, but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit there will be music despite everything. Now we stand at the prow again of a small ship, anchored late at night in a tiny port, looking over to the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat moves slowly and then comes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come. Well, it's a very rich and mixed poem, a brief for the defense by Jack Gilbert. But particularly notice those lines. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. Those lines are written by someone who knows, someone who understands that if we don't grab this moment of respite, refuge, and regeneration, it may not come again. And we return any moment now to the ruthless furnace of this world. This fungible or transient flesh, which serves as Shakespeare's Richard II noted, as cover and paste to our bones, is truly borrowed. And the longer we live, the more the source of our borrowing seems to reclaim its loan to us. As another poet, Stanley Kunitz, reminds us, I only borrowed this dust. During this brief transaction we call our life, we are told to be happy. I, for one, have tried earnestly to be happy, and occasionally have been flush with happiness. And yet happiness is the goal or purpose of life does not speak to me of very much anything that's authentic. And still, truly, I am flooded with happiness to be with you this afternoon and to reflect together on this elusive and evanescent thing we call happiness. How can these two things be true at the same time? We live, on the one hand, in the ruthless furnace of the world, and we're told to be happy. Recently, a hospital nurse said to me before a painful procedure, "Go to your happy place now." I told her respectfully, "This is my happy place." I was trying to be mindful of her good intentions and my battered but realistic view of the world at the same time. On another note, and I add parenthetically, another nurse asked me, how does a psychoanalyst differ from a psychiatrist? Well, among other things, I said, we try to catalyze a conversation with the unconscious. She thought for a while, and then she said, I get it. You work with coma patients. Well, I really didn't try to explain what we really do, but it did occur to me sometimes we are all in a coma, so to speak. But if in my sentence to the nurse, this is my happy place, I also experience pain, I do not forget for the moment the lighter hours that life sometimes brings us. So in those lighter hours, I do not forget somewhere in the ruthless furnace of the world, someone else is suffering. One of that eternal optimist Samuel Beckett's characters, while waiting for a fellow that never shows up, notes that the quantity of tears is constant in the world. In order for someone to be laughing over here, someone has to be weeping over there. This line of reasoning may depress you, but it's a very Jungian challenge. The challenge to hold the tension of opposites. Any view, any practice that sides with one value at the cost of the other leads to bad ends of one kind or another. So, what is this thing we call happiness? Is happiness ontological? That is to say, does it exist in and for itself in some metaphysical, recognizable form? If it has some ontological form, is it a noun then? If it's a noun, what does it look like? Is happiness hiding somewhere in Buenos Aires? And if we are clever enough, can we all figure that out and move there? Can we ever determine a surefire path to happiness? Or should we even try? The novelist Gustave Flaubert once concluded, and I quote, "To be stupid, selfish, and have good health are the three requirements for happiness. Though if stupidity is lacking, all is lost." Well, that's an aphorism meant to be humorous, but it's also very pointed. To be stupid means to be essentially unconscious. If we're really conscious, can we also be happy? The last thing I want to be known for is the guy who's against happiness. So I better explain myself a bit further. I devoutly wish for your happiness, for mine, for that of my children, and for all of somebody's children who walk this planet. But I've learned to hold my breath that I, they, we, you will ever arrive at a steady place called happiness and remain there until the curtain falls on the last scene of that melodrama we have mounted on history's stage for all of these turbulent centuries. Some folks are unhappy that they're not permanently happy. I've literally had people tell me that using Facebook has made them miserable because there they are witness to how happy their friends are with their fabulous children and their many loving times together. Not too many put the other side of their story online. And so we're to assume if they are happy at this happiness game and we are not, what's wrong with us? Let me show you the picture of a fellow who, for the moment, is very happy. Could we put this up on the screen? Can you put that on the screen? There we go. Thank you. Isn't he blissful? Isn't he at the top of his game? Isn't he so pleased with himself that he cannot imagine that he has a train of trouble, a train having left Sao Paulo at 6:45 and traveling at 86.4 miles per hour headed right toward him? Since he's yet to take the math class to help him figure out when the train arrives at his door, we can allow him to remain happy as a clam. But as far as we know, clams are not very conscious. It is consciousness and our imaginative capacity to summon up the competing portraits of reality, portraits that combine to bring the difficult hours to our vexed sleep. You can take his picture off, if you will, but try to remember, that's how we started off. As the Australian poet Fleur Adcock confessed in her short poem, Things, there are worse things than having behaved foolishly in public. There are worse things than this miniature betrayals committed or endured or suspected. There are worse things than not being able to sleep for thinking about them. It's 5 a.m. All the worst things have come stalking in and stand icily about the bed, looking worse and worse and worse. Now, strangely, that little poem from Fleur Adcock is funny in a way. It's sort of like everything you are afraid of, everything you worry about is right there at the foot of your bed at 5 in the morning when you have no defenses. And those are the moments, the difficult times, I find my difficult hours usually 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour of the wolf. Now, who does not recognize these visitations by worry that we've all experienced in the ghostly hours of pre-dawn? That how often do we ask the question, are we meant to be happy? If I am so meant and I'm not happy, is there something wrong with me? Being happy does not seem to be a large consideration for most of the rest of the animal kingdom. A place to sleep, protection from predators, and food to forage seems enough to still their instinctual needs. But this human animal remains bewitched, bothered, and bewildered by the messiness of it all. Once, when I was in Switzerland, during my period of training over there, I rented a room from a lawyer. He came home early once to find someone weeping in the consulting room. And later he asked me why I would ever want to spend my life sitting around with crying people. I didn't even tell him about the time I was invited also during training to an autopsy while doing an internship in a psychiatric hospital. That autopsy didn't make me happy, but I was happy to learn more about how the body works and how autopsies work. I think I did tell him it makes me happy to be invited to be present to the story of others, including their suffering. But I don't think he understood that. So the rest of our relationship changed thereafter to deliberate trivialities and distractions. Perhaps at the end, life is meaningless. Yet we are meaning-seeking creatures who are driven to understand it. Failing that, we attempt to form some meaningful relationships to life. We learn from archetypal psychology, from the core of primitive religions, and from quantum physics today, and from the artist's eye, that all is energy. Remember, the anthropologist Teilhard de Chardin said once, spirit is matter slowed enough to allow us to see it. Matter itself is dynamic, a temporary arrangement of energy. Reportedly, religious symbols or prayers, works of art, or an expressive practice can so act on our psyche as to channel that energy when it has been blocked, deadened, or split off. Meaning, as we all know, makes life bearable and is the gift of being here in the ruthless furnace of the world. As that always cheerful philologist of Basel, Switzerland, Friedrich Nietzsche once observed, the person who has a why can live with any how. Apparently, happiness has a lot of sales value. We see it promoted all the time on commercials. One never sees a glum family driving off with a new Toyota. During the commercials for a quiz show, one can always view the new dread diseases which await the elderly and all the wonderfully named medications that are titrated to cure them, while providing tons of new side effects squeezed in by a fast reader. And then we have something today called positive psychology, designed to emphasize right thinking and right conduct. The emergence of this fashionable approach is especially American in its mentality. The American can-do philosophy, allied with muscular efforts toward one's goals, will reportedly bring about happiness and a sense of well-being. Over 2.5 millennia ago, Brother Job, who was not welcomed in the precincts of the privileged, but he was the original positive psychologist, who also thought that right thinking and right practice would lead to abundance and well-being. And I won't bother to tell you what happened to Brother Job. Today, if you wish, you can travel to New Haven, Connecticut, and take the most popular course at Yale. Yale University is offering a course on happiness, and it's being visited by hundreds of undergraduates at the same time. They can't keep the students out of a class called happiness. So the course on happiness is taught by Professor Laurie Santos, and quote, it reveals misconceptions about happiness, knowing features of the mind that lead us to think the way we do, and the research that can help us change, end quote. the student is encouraged to incorporate new behaviors and expect new outcomes. Perhaps the utopian vision of building a life of happiness would not only be possible, but desirable for all of us if the universe would only cooperate. If right attitudes and practices kept that cell from metastatic incursion, or that bolt on the roller coaster would be found before the car slips off the rail, or that child walking in front of a car be called to a safer home. But sooner or later, suffering comes to all of us. Perhaps in her phrase, annoying features of the mind, Professor Santos is intuiting the presence of those noisome complexes we all acquire along the way. And yes, they can and must be challenged, yes, lest we be locked into our misery. Every complex is a defense of a perception, a fractional worldview generated by the pressures of that hour when they were formed. Different forces produce different message centers in all of us, but we all have our appointments with disappointment, betrayal, grief, and loss. So much of what we call happiness is, as we well know, contextual. Did many who attended the clashes of the gladiators have thoughts about the lives sacrificed before them? Or did they open a box of popcorn and enjoy the spectacle? Do we watch, as we watch professional sports on television, ever reflect on what young people are doing desperately with their bodies and their souls? I do. For a thirsty person, a drink of water is momentary happiness. Consider this old joke for a moment. A man is crawling across the desert. He finally comes across a stand selling ties in the desert, selling ties, which I didn't wear today. What would I want with a tie? He jeers the peddler. Finally, on his last legs, he climbs a small hill and sees a rich, lush green oasis with fountains of water gushing everywhere. Summoning his last strength, he rushes to the entrance, whereupon a guard stops him and says, "I'm sorry, sir, but you have to have a tie to enter here." Well, in the midst of talking about happiness, I thought I would insert a little bit of a joke. I hope it came through in the translation. So do we define the absence of suffering happiness? Is the question of happiness to be put aside, to be sorted out in an afterlife, which at best would be another life and not this miserable one? What forms of denial or wish fulfillment or moral emptiness are necessary to achieve a happy hour in the midst of a world such as ours? In fact, during so-called happy hour, and I don't know what the phrase would be in Portuguese, in happy hour, do we get happy or just numb ourselves to the intensity of it all? For a person to live in a semi-permanent state of happiness, a large capacity for denial, repression, distraction, and ready impulse to look the other direction seem necessary. Such a life will prove to be fugitive rather than engaged, with the superficial crowding out the depths where the authenticity really lives. Such a life is a constant wish to have the anabasis, that is to say, the hilltop experience without the katabasis, the descent into the depths, that it is necessary companion. Some of you may know I spent in the last 3 years really, as much time in hospitals and rehabilitation facilities over that time than I did outside of them. I had many opportunities to reflect on Jung's late life definition of God. You may recall when he was asked to clarify and expand his offhand comment in his famous 1959 interview, he did not say he believed in God, but rather he knew God. Jung elaborated when so many people called to question him, what did you experience? What is your evidence? What do you mean by I know? He said, and I paraphrase, quote, I call God that which flings itself violently across my path and alters my conscious intentions for good or for ill. I'll repeat that. I call God that which flings itself violently across my conscious path and alters my conscious intentions for good or for ill. In these last couple of years, being treated for 2 cancers in a very aggressive protocol, and then finding the bones of my spine fracturing and splintering, leading to risky spinal surgeries, I had and still have many an hour with pain and with emergent questions. I considered many times Jung's heretical definition provocative and helpful because it requires the ego to reframe its pictures of the world, its agenda, and its expectations. Instead of asking, as I did at first, how quickly do I regain my former life as I knew it, full of travel and fine unions to meet around the world, including Brazil, I was brought instead to ask, what can I do with these greatly reduced capacities to serve the values I most treasure, to sustain an equitable presence in marriage, and to live with an uncertain prognosis that may kick in with crippling or lethal blows at any moment? Balance all of that with a Buddhistic reminder that suffering arises in significant fashion from our resistance to reality. It is compounded by our attachment to the desires and fantasies about how the world should be rather than how it is. The more we cling to these fantasies, the more happiness will elude us. I am blessed that I have a caring and constant spouse, my wife, Jill, and she played a large role in my resilience and my recovery. But it was a struggle which I depict in a poem I wrote just after the last surgery, and it's titled The Lady with the Lamp. As a child, I was once so afraid of doctors that I decided to be one, thinking I would learn secrets to stand up to the fears. Without knowing it, later I did my best to distance myself. And, excuse me, I have some pages out of line here. If you'll forgive me for one moment. I'm sorry. Well, I've lost a page to that poem here. Okay, I found it. It was just sticking together. Let me read the first stanza again. I was once so afraid of doctors that I decided to be one, thinking I would learn secrets to stand up to the fears. But without knowing it, I did my best to distance myself from the odious kingdom of pain, the ravening body that leeches the soul away. At midlife, I left academia and retrained as a psychoanalyst. While working in a psychiatric hospital, my mentor, a grizzled sergeant of war's past, said to me, "Come with me, Hollis. I have a patient you would work well with." We entered a room full of observers. On the table below was Picasso's Guernica, or so I thought. I assembled the splayed organs until the form of a woman took its place. The old sergeant's joke, apparent now. What I had run from was staring right there on the table, through me. As Jung has put it, what is denied inwardly comes to us in the outer world, and we call it fate. Now, these decades later, I've returned from the hospital again, covered with scars from operations, burned from radiation, clanking with prostheses made in factories somewhere. I ache for reprieve, but I didn't want to leave Jill alone, so I came home again, at least till the next time. Through it all, her face summoned me across the fog-ridden, shroud-laden sea to this stupefying, ignorant world where bludgeons and scalpels perform their daily office. And that's the end of the poem. What suffering brings us to most is the query that Jung proposed that each of us consider. And I truly think about this every day in my work and my private life. What supports you when nothing supports you? What a wonderful developmental question that is. What supports you when nothing supports you? That will be with us the rest of our lives, for sooner or later we get flung back upon ourselves. While I am most grateful to modern medical science and the loving support of friends and family, there are many dark hours when we're wholly alone and must consider the radical question life brings to us. How will you live your life when it's not yours to control? How will you live your life when it's not yours to control? The chief effect of our social conditioning and the 1,000 necessary adaptations of childhood to a world it cannot manage is the progressive erosion of our instinctual guidance, that within each of us that tells us what is right for us and gives us the strength to persevere in the presence of suffering and defeat. A couple of years ago, while doing a Zoomcast with a London host, I was asked who in history I would most like to interview. Having been raised in Springfield, Illinois, not far from Chicago, my first thought was the great statesman Abraham Lincoln. But then I thought most of us would, if we really had the chance, go back and want to talk to ourselves as a 10-year-old. We now know what that child most needed: modeling, mentoring, instruction, affirmation, and most of all, permission to feel what he or she really feels, to risk what rises from within and is asking expression. That child we were needs to be told that he or she is already equipped by nature for the trials of life. And if only he trusts himself, hangs in there, he or she will come out the other side of these conflicts. That child needs to be told that his fears are normal and natural, but that he's still summoned to live a life as fully as possible in the face of that fear. He needs to know that that other within that sometimes speaks to us in the middle of the night is his real self, and that honoring that dear soul in the ruthless furnace of this world will be his lifelong task. From time to time, you may share that child with others, but mostly you are to begin a lifelong conversation with that child and create the ways in which he or she may explore and express that soul's desire for joy, for creativity, and for the exuberance of so many kinds. And even more, the adult needs to remember that in a forest of bewildering choices and tension-fraught costs, that child's intuitive knowing is also the long-sought compass needle for finding our true north through the darkest and coldest of hours. When we risk this journey, something does rise from within us to support us and to direct us. Some deep knowing of the way, even when we are most lost. If that first step into the unknown is not taken, something within will never be birthed in this world. If one is seduced by the known only, our possible children will remain in the closet forever, and one's earthly children will have to clear out that closet for us. To each of us, this summons rises with each dawn and awaits our decision. As Brother Hamlet put it succinctly, to be or not to be, that's the question. No one can accept that or escape that question or evade the summons without something within dying. Whatever small chip we were entrusted to bring to the great mosaic of life remains in the closet, and the whole is forever diminished by our timorous spirit. But where, you ask, is our esteemed subject happiness in all this? Do we not recognize that in our nervous concern with happiness, we've been absorbed into a larger frame of discussion? The issue of happiness is legitimate and will not go away, but it does get reframed. Trusting that inner voice will inevitably bring one into conflict with the world, beginning in the family of origin. One is never spared that conflict, for conflict lies at the heart of life's dynamics. Something in the unconscious is forever seeking conscious expression. Perhaps not literally, but certainly not wishing to go neglected for a lifetime. That voice within is the voice of the soul. But we also have to remember the noisy complexes have voices, to be sure, as well. But there is a larger voice that supersedes them. One complex may cry out, security at all costs, but does not comprehend the price of security is that the larger summons goes unheard, unattended. We just didn't show up when called to life. Another voice within us cries out, try to fit in, not understanding that this seductive need will sabotage the expression of the soul, the good being the enemy of the better. Still another voice laments, but I will be so alone. Not knowing then and perhaps never that when one has a living dialogue with the soul, one is never wholly alone. There is always a rich and engaged presence which satisfies the question, what supports us when nothing supports us? I do not think we are here to follow our bliss or seek happiness overtly. Real life, the ruthless furnace of daily life, asks something more of us. Perhaps it's better expressed to say, follow your passion. As long as you recall, at least in the English word, the passion derives from the Latin passio, which means to suffer. Even moments of high achievement arrive within suffering as the necessary companion. What matters so much to you that you suffer its demands upon you, yet the service of which enriches your journey? Let me repeat that question. What matters so much to you that you suffer its demands upon you, yet the service of those demands also enriches your journey? Perhaps we may conclude that the object of life is not to be successful, whatever that means, or to be happy, but to find and serve that which is worthy of our service. If we don't find what is worthy of our service, you can be sure we'll be serving the voices of those complexes that are less worthy. So we move through this life, exploring alpine meadows of joy and spontaneity, balanced by compensatory excursions into the savannas of suffering. That voice, the voice of the soul, speaks to us each day quietly. If we ignore it long enough, it will roar thunderously in our ears. If we still ignore it, it will burst through our front door and we will ascribe its presence as fate, perhaps rather than the sum of our unconscious choices that built into a world of consequences. In the end, life will consume us. The word desire is so important. It came from the Latin that meant the star that guided the mariner across the tempest-tossed seas. Desire is what gets us into trouble, and trouble is where the soul is most manifest. If we wish to live fully, it's not happiness that's the goal. It's rather to find what is worthy of consuming us, to find ourselves consumed by that which we've also come to love. Happiness as a goal is too small a piece of the whole, although it's often on the periphery of the most difficult of struggles. So the voice speaks to us daily and says to us, rise, go up, step into the world once more. You will get knocked down again, but this is where your life is meant to take you. The soul and the world are waiting to see you once brave, once ready to take it all on again, once more up for the day's struggle. The Greek novelist Nikos Kazantzakis once wrote of his prayer to God as if a captain reporting to his general saying, quote, "Here is how I fought the battle today in my sector. and here is how I plan to fight again tomorrow. The soul serves the ministries of this invisible world, and from time to time may even prove to be the builder of our outer institutions, the shaper of the collective will to acknowledge the invisible and its demands upon us. As Jung noted, exploring the meaning of the great cathedral of Cologne is not to be understood as an exploration on mineralogy. If you risk enough, you'll be blessed by the soul killing you, but remember to thank her. She has brought you into this world. She has animated the funeral garments with the red flush of life, and she's brought you your journey. If sometimes you may lie broken and bereft, no matter, she keeps calling and will keep calling. Trust that the voice in the dark wood will continue to call you and daily leave breadcrumbs in the forest for you to follow. Ultimately, she will kill you, but she's also given you the best parts of your life. So rise from slumber, find what you love, and let it kill you. And then from time to time, you may find yourself, to your astonishment, happy for a while. Well, such is the formal paper or reflections on that subject. I want to just expand in a rather long footnote on that in a more extemporaneous way. In effect, what Jungian psychology gives to each of us is the possibility of extending our conversation with the inner world. As I said to that nurse, one of the differences with analytic psychology is we're not so concerned about the behaviors, but from whence they come. We often start with our outer behaviors or our states of the soul in depression or addiction or loss or whatever that brings us into this work. But we don't stop there. We ask, from whence has it come? What is its purpose? Why is the psyche responding in this way? I personally was blessed at midlife with a depression. At the time, I did not consider that a blessing. I thought of it, of course, as something I wanted to shed as quickly as possible. But I came to realize, as a result of my first round of analysis, that I had to ask the question, why has the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the places where the executive function of the ego is wishing to invest its energy? Why is the psyche not cooperating? Now, that's not a question that normally occurs to us. We quickly say, how quickly do I get rid of my suffering? That's understandable. Give me a pill for that. Give me 5 easy steps for that. Tell me in 30 days, this and that will happen. That is how our whole culture is organized today, to spare us the perils of this journey. And yet the psyche doesn't cooperate when it doesn't wish to. We may mask our symptoms. And so the response of that world has to go even deeper. In a way, part of what we have to do is relearn what the child knew, recognizing all of the avenues with which or through which the psyche is speaking to us. And I want to enumerate them quickly. You all know what I'm about to tell you, but what I'm about to tell you is to remind each of us, myself included, what we daily have to remember in order to recognize and act upon the fact that our psyche already knows what's right for us. Let me repeat that. Something within us knows what's right for us. You know that. You've known that in your darkest hours. Then comes the question, is there sufficient awareness and personal courage to address that? In the 1950s, Jung wrote a letter to Olga Freber-Kapteyn, who was the founder of the Aranos Conference. And he said to her, the opus, the work of individuation, consists of 3 parts, of which he said psychology can only address the first part, which is to gain insight. And that's important and critical, but insight is not enough alone. Jung went on to say, after that come the moral qualities of the individual. Second, he said, is courage to face what must be faced. And third, he said, is in persistence or endurance over time until we live our way into a different place, or we may not have changed the outer circumstances, but we've changed the inner way of experiencing them. And so that letter suggests insight, courage, and persistence over time is what brings us to these transformations. Now, when we stop up and think about, there are at least 5 venues in which the psyche speaks to us on a daily basis. The first I've already mentioned, that's symptomatology. Our whole modern system, and understandably, says, how quickly do we get rid of the symptom? Rather, we ask, why has it come? What is it asking of us? Every symptom is in some way the expression of the refusal of the psyche to capitulate, to cooperate with some action or some situation in which it is being violated. Secondly, we have the feeling function. We all know about feeling. We are flooded with feelings. But did you ever stop to think about, we never create our feelings. Feelings are autonomous responses of the psyche to how things are going as experienced by the psyche. I may be in a particular job, for example, or a profession in which I'm rewarded. I'm applauded for doing that. It's something I prepared in school for, et cetera, et cetera. And everything is going well, and yet inside is that ache that says something is missing here. And do I keep overriding that because I'm addicted to that salary or that payoff that comes from being successful? What if we're in a relationship and there's some part of us that is withheld in a very protected way? Where is that coming from? What is that feeling function? Is what is right and wrong for us. And again, as a qualitative analysis, as seen by the psyche. And we ignore our feelings to our peril. So the old cliche about getting in touch with your feelings has merit because it means I have to stop and pay attention to what do I really feel about this. I have to put that word really there because I can't trust my first response. My first response will tend to be the protection of the status quo ante. It will be the defense of the way things already are. It'll be the defense of the behaviors that have gotten me into this trouble in the first place. I had a client in Houston once who said from his Alcoholics Anonymous group, they had a saying, which I thought was so brilliant and could apply to all of us. The saying was, this isn't working for me, but I do it very well. This isn't working for me, but I do it very well. And so we get caught in the behaviors that have made us successful or well adapted, but something inside tells us something is wrong here. Do we stop and pay attention to that? Thirdly, as we know, we have energy systems. When you're doing what's right for you, the energy is there. Now, it's true, we can mobilize our energy, and we have to. On Monday morning, whether you wish to or not, you get up and you go to the tasks of the week. In the middle of the night, you get up and you go and feed the crying baby and change its diaper. We can mobilize energy to attend the tasks of daily life. But if we're doing that over time in soul-killing labor, we know that the energy departs and we're left with ennui, desuetude, depression. And so when we're doing what's right for us, the energy is there. My wife, among other things, has been a painter. And when she is painting, she loses sense of time when she's caught in the canvas. When I'm writing, I don't know what day of the week it is because I brought my ego consciousness into a relationship to something within that is seeking expression through me. And in that relationship, I don't exist, but I am nonetheless the vehicle through whom or through which that which is seeking expression enters this world. So energy systems over time, also one of the key indications from the self, capital S, what is right for us and what is wrong for us. Fourthly, as we all know, we have dreams. Sleep research tells us that we average 6 dreams per night in a normal dream cycle. And I know most of you are going to say, well, I don't remember my dreams, or I never dream that much. But sleep research tells us that we do. And even if we don't remember our dreams, it's clear nature does not waste energy. That dreaming does do something that helps the ecology of the soul. Perhaps what it's doing is metabolizing the magnitude of stimuli that comes to us in any 24-hour period, a magnitude that forces us to take time off, to sleep, and to restore the system. But as we all know, because we've had the experience, when we work with our dreams over time, we understand there's a different element there altogether. The dreams are not arbitrary. They're not just cause and effect with what happened during the course of the day. They are the psyche's response to its own narrative about what this means. Yes, it would be easier if dreams spoke to us in clearer language, but as Jung pointed out, he said, dreams use the language of nature. And he said our ancestors were closer to nature and understood its capacities and its metaphors far better than our civilization prizes them. So we all know that in time, if you pay attention to your dreams, it will tell you what are the things that are important for you to address and how the psyche is viewing your choices, and sometimes even offers a pathway through the very dense thicket of choices that befall us on a daily basis. And last of all, fifth, is the question of meaning. It's the hardest to define, but you know, and I know, when something is meaningful, it allows us to push through the difficulties, the pain, the consequences. As Jung put it very succinctly, he said, the smallest of things with meaning is always greater than the largest of things without meaning. And we all know that's true. I forgot to add, by the way, that if you reach the age of 80, which I'm well past now, sleep research tells us we will have spent 6 years of our life dreaming. Think of that, 6 years out of 80 are spent dreaming, not sleeping, but dreaming. That says something important about the place and role of dreams to a culture that pays so little attention to them. But the question of meaning is something that we, from an ego standpoint, cannot manufacture. We can do all the right things. We can serve our values and we can serve our instructions conscientiously. You probably did, I did. And yet we find at times that thing has lost its savor for us. It's lost its capacity to energize us. So the question of meaning is, in the end, the most powerful of those 5 indications that come from the autonomy of the psyche. Now, the reason I mention this is that when we talk about the subject of happiness, we also have to realize, well, happiness certainly can provide comfort or distraction or an interlude to the ego consciousness. Not being a permanent state, it's sooner or later we're brought back into the questions. Why am I here? In service to what? What is the next step that I need to take? And when we begin to address those questions, we frankly need other attitudes and behaviors to help us. And this is why I have felt it is so important and why I was happy to be with you this afternoon. This is why we are obliged, I believe, to utilize the tools that analytic psychology has provided us to help us find the way that is our pathway through life and to lead us to choices that are meaningful. It doesn't in any way promise us longevity or good health. It doesn't promise us to fit in well with the world or achieve the world's acclaim. What it does do is provide you with a sense of inner purpose and an inner connection. I've often been moved by an aphorism created by the American poet Emily Dickinson in 1864. In it, she said very briefly, The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. And Emily Dickinson was acutely aware of the diminishment of institutional power in her time, even though it's almost 200 years ago. And she was acutely aware of the need for an inner source of guidance. And her metaphor of the inner compass is one that I think is appropriate for each of us. Each of us has an inner compass, something in us that knows what is right for us. And if we pay attention to it, if we trust it, if we risk it over time, if we come back to it and open ourselves to its inquiries, then we will find from time to time that our life is filled with happiness. Well, it's the top of the hour, and I was told to talk to the hour. And now we'll just open this up to your questions and comments, and I'll be happy to have any sort of responses that you would like to share with the group as well. So, please.
James, obrigado pela tua fala, absolutamente instigante. Acho que a gente vai poder ter uma imensa troca de ideias, de impressões. Vamos lá, gente, vamos aproveitar a oportunidade de estar aqui com o James e poder presenteá-lo com boas perguntas. Quem quiser fazer a pergunta,
Marcos,
coloca no chat. Oi.
será que o James não quer um tempinho para ele dar uma andadinha, se esticar?
James, você gostaria de fazer um pequeno intervalo de 5 minutos?
Thank you.
Tá.
Go ahead.
Então vamos lá, seguindo o protocolo do teatro. Quem quiser fazer a pergunta, coloca o nome, eu chamo e a pessoa faz. James, queria começar com 2 perguntas para você. Dentro dessa perspectiva que você trouxe da felicidade, muito particular, a primeira pergunta seria, para você, o que seria o oposto da felicidade? O que seria o avesso do ser feliz? Acho que essa é uma primeira pergunta que eu queria que você pudesse pensar junto conosco. E a segunda, a gente vive num momento cultural onde a felicidade se tornou um objeto de consumo, né? A felicidade virou um objeto na prateleira de consumo. Aquilo que era um desejo, né? Era uma vontade de ser feliz, um desejo de ser feliz, tornou-se agora uma obrigação, um imperativo. Você tem que ser feliz. Dentro desse cenário, como seria possível recuperar uma potência do ser feliz? Como seria resgatar uma boa imagem da ideia de felicidade? Você acha que é possível ainda?
Sure. Well, first of all, the opposite of happiness is misery. And most of humankind has lived a miserable existence. We live in a time and a culture, as we know, where material abundance, scientific and technological achievements have provided the comforts of life, the assurance of electricity, for example, that's keeping my room cool, medicine that has saved our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And we grow to take for granted those moments of release. If we took all those things away, we'd quickly be restored to the enormous struggle for life that is daily representative. So many people on the earth to this day realize that the conversation we're having is not even available to most of humanity. And their life is often miserable. But it's not to say that there aren't moments. You know, I have a program I've given on comedy, Why Do We Laugh? And it's full of jokes. But it's interesting how our jokes can come out of the most difficult of places. You know, for example, there's a whole chapter in an encyclopedia of Jewish humor on concentration camp humor. like in the worst of human circumstances, the spirit survived in some way to make light of and not to deny, but to show its independence of spirit from those circumstances. But you see, happiness as a concept becomes an idea, and an idea can become an ideology. You know, the idea could be a good idea or a neutral idea, but an ideology is something that has its own momentum and tends to refuse any kind of contradiction. So if I'm supposed to be happy, what's wrong with me then? And I'm not unhappy. It's just that if happiness is supposed to be my condition of life, look what a miserable failure I am. And that's what many people come to. When I was talking about people's reaction to Facebook, I've heard that from clients, several clients, who were miserable because they were not as happy as all of their neighbors. And I said, why would you believe their Facebook accounts when, in fact, you know, their lives might be complicated and difficult in ways you don't even know? So again, you know, is it possible, and I don't remember all the details of the question, frankly, is it possible to recognize that the question of meaning supersedes happiness? That, you know, if you experience something in a meaningful way, happiness is a byproduct of that, even if the circumstances are very unpleasant, even if the outcomes are unpleasant. The way in which one experiences something from a different place, a place where the soul can go, but not the rest of one's being, perhaps. Then in those moments, you see one's reframed the whole question of happiness. We're not here to be happy. Happiness, again, is a momentary condition, a byproduct. But on the other hand, we're here to have meaning. Why would I say that? Well, based on my reading of the psyche, both with patients through the years and my own psyche, and to realize that when meaning is present, it reframes the conditions of one's life, of one's marriage, of one's work condition, of one's relationship to one's fears, one's relationship to the magnitude of life's challenges, one's issues of aging and mortality, for example. I mean, these are the bottom lines of our existence. And when we approach those bottom lines of existence, what is it that sustains us? It's meaning, not happiness. Happiness is, again, fragile and elusive. And, you know, it seems to me that one of the worst forms of existence is what we see in the so-called jet sets, where people have so much material abundance and that they have to live these lives that are constantly looking for the next sensation. One of Hemingway's characters, sitting in a bar in Spain, says, you know, this is all we do, isn't it? We fornicate and we have new drinks to try out, you see. In other words, how do we kill the time now that we're happy? Right? The two characters in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, the play ends, first act ends, we are happy. Now that we're happy, what do we do? Where do we go? And the stage directions say they do not move because they're stuck in their situation. So they are professing happiness, but they're utterly stuck in meaninglessness, an apt portrait of the postmodern life. So again, happiness as a topic was not a topic I even wanted to address. It was assigned to me, and I reluctantly addressed it. And then in the end, of course, found it to be, as every subject will, a rich area for exploration. And so I would hope two things from our conversation today. One, if you feel unhappy about being unhappy, at least that's been recalibrated for you, and that you realize that, you know, meaning is a more important question. And if I'm living a life that's meaningful to me, and that's defined by the psyche, not by outer perimeters. But secondly, you know, if I find that I am called to face these fundamental existential realities in my life, as sooner or later we are, then the question is, with what attitude and behaviors do I approach that? And happiness is not the criterion, but meaning is. And again, when we're living in meaningful ways, from time to time, we're flooded with happiness. So I don't know if I've answered those questions, but forgive me if I haven't. But we'll try the next question, perhaps.
Bom, eu vou deixar a próxima. Vou abrir agora para as outras pessoas, tá, James? Vamos lá. Cláudio, por favor, faz a sua pergunta. Tá aí,
Bom,
Cláudio.
primeiro agradecer, né, o professor Dr. James Hollis, né? Nos conhecemos no Rio de Janeiro e fico muito feliz em revê-lo, desejando saúde. Bem, Dr. James Hollis, há uma proliferação de profissionais da psicologia que vendem essa ideia da felicidade fácil e meritocrática. Como o senhor acredita que nós junguianos, podemos contribuir com o debate? Porque parece que, de uma forma geral, né, há uma certa resistência em abordar a temática. Né? Mas como é que a gente pode dar uma boa contribuição para esse campo?
You know, I had some problems with the sound. Every third word or so would break up. Could you summarize the question for me again briefly? I apologize, but I couldn't hear it all.
Certo. Eu falei a respeito dessa proliferação de profissionais da psicologia que vendem essa ideia fácil, da felicidade fácil e da meritocracia, né? Não sei como seria a tradução desse termo em inglês. Né? Como é que acredita que nós, junguianos, podemos contribuir com esse debate, já que parece que há uma certa resistência, até mesmo em abordar o tema, né? Mas parece ser uma questão importante para a gente se adentrar e aprofundar.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, Jungian psychology will never be popular for this reason, because it's not only complex at times, but it's not about making us happy or well-adjusted. It's more about finding that which is worthy of our life's investment. That's a different question. And of course, if you go into the bookstores, they all have these bulging self-help sections that promise 5 easy steps to this or that, or 30 days to whatever. And in the end, they fail people because they don't work. If they work, you'd only need one of those books. In the end, life is difficult. Life is hard. And the moment we figured out what it's all about, the playing field, and we'll be forced to reconsider everything. So that's why that Jung's comment, when he was asked to find his concept of God, he said he called God that which overthrows the ego. And I think what Jung was trying to get at, it was a radical form of respect for the mystery, because the ego, frankly, wishes to manipulate the mystery. It wishes, I mean, many times our theologies and our psychologies represent our ways of trying not only to make sense of life, but to move into control of life. And perhaps that's understandable, but it's also perhaps delusory. You know, it leads us astray. That's why Jungian psychology will never be popular, but it's a summons to a lifetime of questioning and a lifetime of raising questions of meaning. And I feel that Jung's work has not fully been discovered yet, long over a century now, but only in certain areas of this world has its applicability become discovered. And it's not just for affluent individuals, it's not just for educated individuals, it's for the ordinary person. Because who is free of complexes? Who is free of these questions about life? What do you think your life means? Where do you think your choices are coming from? I often will ask a question like, it's not so much what you are believing, it's why you are believing it that makes the difference. Or you can say of a certain behavior, where does this come from within you? It may be a good behavior, but it's coming from a bad place, like a codependent place within you, or need to avoid conflict within you. Understandable, but maybe not sufficient for the governance of your life. So there are different kinds of questions that come up in the Jungian dialogue. And it is a dialogue, what in Swiss German they call the Auseinandersetzung, the setting one thing over against the other, or the dialogue or dialectic with the unconscious. How can I talk to the unconscious? It's unconscious. Well, as I said, there are these 5 arenas in which the unconscious is speaking to us on a moment-to-moment basis. You don't have to look for the unconscious, it's looking for you. And then you realize there is a summons to a different kind of conversation, and it requires becoming a grown-up. And what it means to be a grown-up is I'm not going to find it from a guru out there. Jung is not our guru. He's a person who, in his personal life, was very flawed, but who brought insights and techniques to us that are useful even a century plus later. Rather, we have to ask the question, what do you asking of me? And that's not a question that's marketable particularly. It forces a person to go back to it on a daily basis and to recognize that whatever I thought yesterday is no longer applicable. I need to be able to reframe my journey in the face of these changing circumstances. The one thing we need to know that with all of the outer changes and the inner changes, something abides with us. Something, as I said, knows us better than we know ourselves. Something within knows what's right for us. I think we had intimations of that as children. You have Wordsworth's famous poem, Ode on Intimations of Immortality, in which he talks about the child emerging with this sense of celestial light and this sense of being. But every day it gets brushed away and eroded until it fades into the light of common day, and we've lost contact with it. And Wordsworth is writing about that in 1802. So we again recognize that it's still there, it's just buried under the layers of adaptation. Those adaptations are necessary and normal. The first and perhaps most telling thing I learned in Zurich, to my dismay, was what we have become is now our chief enemy or our chief obstacle. Because what we've become is a series of adaptations. And the more I have to adapt to that out there, the less I'm coming from in here. The more I am well adjusted in a crazy world, the less I'm in contact with my own sanity. And then we find ourselves living and attached to our adaptations. They got us this far. So we collude with that and become our own obstacle. That's why typically the suffering has to be sufficient to challenge or break that down in order for me to go back to examine this. That's why I can say today, when I was 35 and had a depression, I'd achieved everything in my life, but I felt depressed. And I had to recognize later that there was a will larger than my ego will operating within my psychic life. And I had to start paying attention to that. It's like the old saying, you can climb the ladder and get to the top. And when you get there, you realize there's no there. In those moments is the experience of meaninglessness. And that's the invitation to the life of meaning. That is that Wendell Berry poem suggested, our true work. Where do you go when you don't know where to go? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, you have to sit and hold that and wait upon that until it begins to speak to you. I could say to you today, quite honestly, that if I need to know what's right for me, it can be from the mundane, how to start an article, or an important life choice about something, if I put it in there metaphorically, and I hold it there, and I respect that, and I wait upon it, it always gets back to me. It may be at 3 in the morning. It may be while I'm driving the car and I'm distracted. It may be coming to me in a passage that I was reading or writing. It may come from a client. But whatever I need to know suddenly is there. And I only know that the hard way, through the experience of through the years of learning to trust there's something inside that knows what is right for me. That will never be easily merchandised. There's no money to be made from that per se. It's something each of us has to learn and to risk on our own. When we do, we begin to find our own personal authority. And that's the biggest project of the second half of life. You're born with authority, that's called instinct. And Jung said all of our problems essentially come from having gotten separated from our instincts. And of course, the problem is if I'm separated from them, how do I know them? Well, because they're in revolt one way or the other. The feeling function just isn't helping anymore. So we recognize that opening oneself to one's own suffering is also the pathway through that suffering to the place of meaning, at which point happiness becomes possible, even in the presence of suffering. Another question, please.
Vamos lá, Silvia. Obrigado, Cláudio. Silvia, por favor.
Bom, boa tarde para todos. É um prazer estar aqui conversando com James Hollis, sou uma admiradora. A minha pergunta é no sentido de a questão da felicidade, quando a pessoa não se sente merecedora de estar feliz, né? Alguém que sente que está bem, está feliz, chegou num momento de plenitude, mas num mundo que a gente está vivendo cheio de desgraças e questões tão dramáticas, ou mesmo questões pessoais da vida daquela pessoa, a felicidade fica junto com a culpa, né? Como eu queria ouvir um pouco o senhor falando um pouco dessa companhia e da felicidade, da sensação de felicidade, ou mesmo do sentido, né? Como o senhor falou, quer dizer, alguém que enxerga um sentido, mas vem uma culpa que parece que tira um pouco do brilho daquele momento.
Okay. Isa, again, can you give me a summary of that, please? I've had a little trouble hearing all of the words. It gets broken up technologically, like every third word gets a little garbled. So just a brief summary, please.
Me interessa ouvi-lo sobre a felicidade quando ela está ligada à culpa. A pessoa não consegue estar feliz e plena.
Guilt?
Guilt, yeah.
Yes.
Sim.
Okay. Well, sure. Well, in the book Swamplands of the Soul, that was the first chapter, was guilt. And I mentioned there are different kinds of guilt. There is, first of all, the guilt that is necessary to having any kind of moral society. If I don't feel accountable for my behaviors and their consequences, then I'm a moral monster. I'm a total narcissist. So that appropriate guilt keeps our society linked together at some functional level. There's also the guilt that comes from living in the first or second world, where you realize so many people are miserable in the world, and one needs to be mindful of that at all times, but not necessarily guilty about that. In other words, if I am not experiencing my happiness at this moment, that's not making anybody else happy on the planet. So I might as well experience what is my reality at that moment, because it is going to change. I'm not able to stay there. So you can count on that. But the third kind of guilt is the one where where a person says, I have this feeling, but I'm not supposed to have this feeling. It's really, in a certain way, a kind of protection against anxiety. It's why there was a book in English whose title was, Why Do I Feel Guilty When I Say No? I mean, there was a person who learned early in life, to have appropriate boundaries, to be able to say no to this or yes to that, can put me at odds with that other person. And so out of my fear of their reaction, my codependence, I've torn down that boundary, and I feel guilty, as if there's something wrong with me if I'm feeling happy at this moment. And that's really a form of codependence. It's being defined by your environment rather than your own experience. Another way of putting it is, and I'm going to be grandiose here, if the gods have allowed you to be happy at this moment, then who are you to deny that or set that aside? Recognize that there's a place for guilt in this world that allows us to take responsibility for our choices. But most of the time, we're here to experience and honor what our life provides us. So that guilt, I would say, is a pseudo emotion. It's really a secondary emotion that's imposed itself upon the primary emotion. It's really an archaic complex weighing in. It says, oh, but you can't do that because it's going to produce this bad effect or that bad effect, So it's a good question. Why do I feel guilty if I'm happy? Well, ask yourself that question. It's a good question, and it's going to be found in the pathogenic history of the individual, not necessarily in the capacity of the gods to make you happy at a given moment. So part of how you can be happy is to say, this is the gift of this moment, and I have to accept it. And I have to somehow experience it as fully as I can, because it may or may not come again. Next question.
Obrigado, Silvia. Eu queria chamar o Alan Vaughan, que é um convidado nosso, acho que está em Nova York. Isa, consegue chamá-lo? Alan?
Yeah. Yes.
Seja bem-vindo, Alan.
Yeah.
I recognize him.
So, Jim, it is so good to see and hear you from Durham here in North Carolina. And I just wanted to ask the simple question, can you comment on the relationship between wisdom, aging, and happiness? It sounds like happiness is transitory and that it might vary from stage to stage along the lifespan, but it seems that wisdom might be necessary to really comprehend the transitional nature of happiness.
Sure. Well, I must acknowledge here that Alan and I spent many an hour together with the Sagbert program on Jungian studies. So it's good to see you, Alan, after all these years. So sure. No, what we call happiness is in many ways contiguous to the environment we're in at that moment. And how easy it is to make a baby laugh or cry in terms of those external stimuli. And often we can distract them in their distress and cause them to laugh, but it's very transitory. There's a big distinction between information and knowledge and wisdom. They're not the same. Information is flooding us. We're drowning in information. We can't manage it. But how do we form it into meaningful categories that ask appropriate questions? That's knowledge. And wisdom ultimately is sorting through to determine what really matters and what doesn't matter in the end, and what abides and what is transitory. So at different stages in one's life, these will come about in differing ways. For example, being a parent, I would say being a parent has probably been the biggest experience of my life, the best experience of my life. But as many of you know, and this is going to sound very neurotic, but at the moment a child is born, you also start worrying about their well-being, and throughout their life, you carry that worry as part of your parenthood. And that doesn't make you happy, but it's part of the meaning experience, certainly. Aging is first of all, the alternative aging is called mortality. So you sort of have to remember that option is always the other alternative. But it is true to say that it's one of the hardest of issues in our time, because those cultures that were linked to the great rhythms of nature, those that were linked to the great mythologies, the mythologies of the Great Mother, of death and rebirth, had a far deeper and I think meaningful connection to the life cycle. And Jung, in his marvelous essay called The Soul in Death, which I mentioned to each of you to look up in the collected works, The Soul in Death it's called, in which he sees mortality as also the fulfillment of the organism. It's not something so much to be feared as it is to be achieved. And he makes some cogent arguments along that line. But the key has to do with the progressive dissociation from the ego's fantasy of sovereignty. In other words, the ego is the central complex of consciousness, as he defined it. And it has an important role. It's tasked with looking both directions before we cross a busy street, or planning our daily activities and so forth. It has a powerful executive function. It gets into trouble when it arrogates to itself powers it doesn't have, when it says, I am the boss, I am in charge, I know who I am, I'm making proper decisions. One could imagine the God saying, did you hear that? That person just said they are in charge here. We'll remind that person who really runs the universe here. So wisdom at some level has to do with relinquishing the ego's inflated position in which it's humbled. Another reason analytic psychology, I think, will never particularly be attractive to the world is it is a humbling process. You see it even in Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he says several times, here's another thing I didn't know about myself, and it felt like a defeat. And, why would it be a defeat? Except the ego had positioned itself to say, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I know who I am. And Jung is saying, here again, I found out that was a fallacious thought on my part. Rather, the ego has to realize its proper position. It's the servant of the soul. It's the servant of the psyche. And as such, one is here to serve. That's why I said, part of the process of second half of life is finding a personal authority. That's of the many voices that come to me at any given moment, do this, do that, don't do this or do that. How do we sort through that and find our proper voice and our choice? That's a very difficult discern process. But it's also true that in the end, it's not our will, it's not our fantasy that carries us through. It's how the ego becomes the servant of the soul that matters. So part of what we have to learn as a species is the progressive disidentification with the ego, and see it as, in some way, the obedient servant of the soul. And it will take us to places that change and reframe our understanding of illness, of suffering, of aging, and ultimately of mortality. Yeats put it this way once. He said, soul, sing, clap hands, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. The tatter in our mortal dress is the aging process. Mm-hmm. The soul has to sing. For every outer tatter, there has to be an inner compensatory development. So another way of putting this, as one's outer powers diminish, the inner powers have to grow and be welcomed in our life. And that means that one has to, on a daily basis, it seems to me, to spend time reflecting upon one's relationship to one's own soul. All of us say, well, I don't have time for that. My former colleague, Marion Woodman, used to say to her clients, if you're going to do this work, you have to devote a minimum of 1 hour a day to working on this, working with your dreams, active imagination, journaling, doing whatever form it takes. And she said, so many people said, but I don't have time for that. And she said, if you don't have time for that kind of soul work, then you're not ready for analysis. And that's a very telling point that she made there. And underneath all of that is the summons to the essential mystery of this journey. What's it about? Well, that's for you to figure it out. Historically, the tribe had the answer to that. Historically, the mediating institutions stood between you and that question and provided you with your answers and the rituals and so forth, presumably sufficient to bring you into relationship with those answers. Today, most of those, many of them, have eroded, even disappeared for moderns, and be replaced by materialism, hedonism, what else? The many distractions of the modern world. And so to have the ego, in a sense, humbled to say, I'm in the presence of that mystery. You know, Jung's definition of life was so succinct. He said it's a short mystery between two great mysteries. Well, the point is, how does that mystery manifest in your life? What is it asking of you? What are you to do with your particular version of that mystery? That's not about the ego, or at least its aggrandizement. The function of the ego there is to keep that question alive and to be open to it, and in some way to serve what emerges from that. And when you do that, you will have a deepened sense of inner purposefulness, and you will experience life as meaningful, not free of suffering, but occasionally rich with happiness, but most of all, guided by meaning. When that's present, anything is possible. And when it's absence, in the end, everything sours. And we all know that. Another question. Good to see you, Alan. Another question.
Yes, thank you, Jim. You're such a sage and a wizard. Those are my special names for you.
What was the first word there?
A sage, S-A-G-E, and wizard.
Oh, well, I question that. I'll tell my wife that you said that, and she'll just laugh at that. So
Yeah. Tell her hello too, please.
I shall indeed.
Obrigado, Alan, pela participação. Vamos lá. Dioneia.
Alan's an analyst, currently in North. Yeah.
Olá, boa tarde. Estão conseguindo me ouvir? Porque o áudio falhou um pouco.
Sim.
Boa
Yes.
tarde. Primeiramente, eu queria agradecer, né, ao Dr. James. Foi uma palestra muito incrível, né? Eu acho que ele trouxe muita alma e muita essência, né, nos relatos dele. Então, eu estou extremamente tocada e feliz, né? A gente está falando tanto sobre felicidade, esse momento que vale a pena ser vivido. Então, nesse momento, eu estou feliz. Então, obrigada. A minha pergunta, ela está associada justamente à busca pelo sentido, né? Qual seria a relação da felicidade com essa busca pelo sentido, né? Eu percebo muito no set terapêutico a melancolia atrelada extremamente a essa iminência busca pelo sentido. E aí a minha pergunta é, qual a relação, né, da felicidade com a busca pelo sentido, e se essa busca pelo sentido significa essa alma em coma, né, para essas felicidades da vida, né? Se seria essa alma em coma para o que a gente entende como felicidade nos pequenos momentos, e não na sua constância e totalidade. É isso, muito obrigada.
That last sentence wasn't clear. Is the search for meaning can be a disturbance of our lives? Was that correct? Okay. Well, first of all, the person also mentioned melancholy.
O finalzinho é sobre a
Ok.
felicidade, né? Se seria essa busca do sentido, seria essa alma em coma, né? Para essas pequenas felicidades, para o que as pessoas entendem como felicidade.
Well, I think the meaning question, see, meaning too is not something ontological. That is to say, something tangible in its being. It's an experience. And we don't make it, we don't create it. We can either experience it or it's loss, it's separation. Happiness in that moment occurs when we're in right relationship to our own soul. You see, it's not so much what we did that matters, it's when we're in right relationship to our soul. Let's say that an individual might be called to some sort of public act, and everyone around says this is appropriate, this is right, and so forth. But inside is an inner voice that says, no, your path is to walk away from this. In that moment, one suffers a crisis of identity, a crisis of stories, a crisis of instructions, a crisis of the roadmap that one is to follow. And so one is rather to ask the question, what is the path of meaning for me? And it may well lead to a life of martyrdom or separation. Now, Jung says in his essay on the development of personality, he says, when we go through this process, he called individuation. It's not individualism, it's about serving your unique voice within with respect to its impact upon others. We're not talking about self-indulgence or narcissism here. It's always mindful of its implications for others. But he says, when you serve that, he said, you often have to leave, literally or symbolically, the collective. And he said that incurs a debt, D-E-B-T, debt, like a fiscal debt. And he says you repay that debt by returning to the collective, bringing your more evolved selfhood to your partner, to your committees, to your assignments, to your workplace, and to your children, and so forth. You remember Jung's famous comment, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Well, that's where Jung is saying it's not narcissistic to say live your journey. It's the best thing you can do for your children because it opens to them that journey as well. Because if one doesn't, then the child will be stuck at the same place and will spend their life trying to get unstuck by that or live a life that's they'll either serve that, which repeats the failure, or also be caught in its overcompensation mechanism in the next generation. As Jung felt, he had to do with his own familial history. He said, coming from a long history of clerics and the load up of, I think, 6 clerics in his extended family, he said he felt that they all had stopped asking honest questions and had settled for the dogmas of their time and place. And all of them, he felt, respectfully, were depressed and adrift. And he said because they had lost contact with the living spirit of their religion. So he said it falls to me, Jung, to address the questions they were afraid to address. So that's why I say, if I'm not living my journey, then it's going to be a burden for my children in addition. In other words, in addition to giving them food on the table and security and affirmation, I also have to give them a model of a life lived as honestly as one can, as courageously as one can. And in doing so, when one's providing them with that gift, and not doing that, one's burdening them as well. So, there's always a place, you see, for integrity in this process. And individuation is really about trying to live with integrity with one's own soul. And that word integrity, at least in English, has the word to integrate, to bring together. You see, when we're separated, we're out of our own integrity. We're split. That's what the ugly word neurosis means. We're separated from our own soul. And living with integrity means we have an ongoing conversation with it. May not be a very pleasant conversation at times, because the soul, as we know, can call us to some very difficult places in our journey. You have to remember always that many of the people we would most admire in history are people who had difficult lives, but we admire them because they lived their way through to something. Just one quick example, an obvious one of my heroes, and I have very few, but I have one hero, is Nelson Mandela, because when he and his comrades were unjustly imprisoned, the best years of their life stolen from them, they chose not to give in to despair, but to keep their spirits free. And they actually taught many of their captives to read and write. They were illiterate. And they kept their freedom in prison while their captors were imprisoned in a system that was dehumanizing. And to stay free in those circumstances, I find tremendously inspiring. That word inspire, from the Latin, means to recognize the breath of the spirit within, inspire, to feel that spirit move through one. That's admirable. And that was a path, you see, in which one remains in prison. One's outer powers are insufficient to challenge the powers of the external tyranny, but inside one is free, and that's everything. Another question or comment?
James, vamos fazer a última pergunta, tá bom? E depois a gente finaliza. Rico, tá por aí, Rico?
Tô sim. Hello,
Vamos lá,
Dr.
Rico.
Hollis. Thanks a lot for your time. My question is, please deep dive into animals concept and what is its role in the individuation process according to Jung's psychology.
Sure. Well, today's Jungians don't use the terms anima, animus very much because they tend into our modern and postmodern era to often have a kind of narrow gender limitation. But what Jung was getting at the time, and this is important, I think, to recognize the voice of the soul is going to be that other. You notice I never used those words when I was talking. I would rather use phrases like the voice within. There are many voices within. There's a whole assembly of shouting voices inside. You know, they're trying to decide between Lula and Bolsonaro, for example. They're at each other inside all the time. And that's the nature of our lives. But there is a voice there that's your soul, and you have to find it. And it's other to consciousness. So Jung, back in the 1915, 1920, used that in terms of genderized concepts. It's like if I'm a man, then the other is the anima, is my inner feminine side. Well, it's not just my feminine, it's part of my masculine nature, except that I may be separated from it. And of course, if I'm separated from this within, I'm going to be separated from outer women in some way, you see, and vice versa for women. So realize here how so many times our relationships with people in the outer world are just as muddled and confused and contradictory as the voices we have, as our relationship to our inner voices. So remember, the words anima and animus are simply Latinate forms for the word soul. So Jung is saying the voice of the soul within is experienced as other, but it is most uniquely yours. It's only other from the ego standpoint, but it is the deepest part of you that's true, the deepest part of you that is timeless. And as I was saying with Yeats earlier, as our outer possibilities diminish, and if you live long enough, all outer possibilities diminish, then the internal, the growth of that internal dialogue, which just doesn't necessarily remove you from the world, it just removes you from the chatter of the world to hear your own inner dialogue. That voice is the thing that carries you through. to speak to that question Jung asked, and I mentioned at the beginning, what supports you when nothing supports you? There's always something within that rises to support you in the most difficult of circumstances. But you also have to be willing to be humbled enough to pay attention and to open to that. That's what the word therapy from the Greek means, therapoion, to listen or attend to psyche, the soul. Psychotherapy means to listen to the soul when it speaks. So let me say, if we're about to conclude, what a pleasure it is to be. I've not been able to return physically to Brazil, but I consider so many Brazilians friends, and I have only the warmest of memories of my 2 trips to Brazil, and I'm very grateful for the presence of the Jungian societies of Brazil. And I wish each of you well, and each of you a more interesting conversation in the times to come.
James, queria te agradecer por essas 2 horas aqui da sua mais absoluta doação para conosco, pela tua sabedoria, tua experiência, tua forma absolutamente almada, cheia de ânima de se comunicar. É uma imensa alegria. Queria agradecer muito. Mas eu queria te fazer a última pergunta. A última pergunta. O Brasil teve um músico chamado Tom Jobim. Isa, me ajuda aí, Isa. Tom Jobim, um dos pais da Bossa Nova. E ele tem uma música chamada A Felicidade. Eu queria ler um trechinho dessa música e saber se essa música poderia ser a trilha sonora dessa fala que você nos presenteou hoje. Então, eu vou ler. Aí, Isa, segura aí, Isa. Vamos lá. Vou ler uma parte da música. Tristeza não tem fim. Felicidade, sim. A felicidade é como a pluma que o vento vai levando pelo ar. Voa tão leve, mas tem a vida breve. Precisa que haja vento sem parar. Precisa que haja vento sem parar. Precisa que haja vento sem parar. Tristeza não tem fim. Você acha que essa canção poderia ser uma boa trilha sonora para o nosso encontro hoje?
Well, I think you'll have to decide that. You know, that's the question. Not avoiding your question. I really think you have to define this in your own terms. And as I said, I have nothing against happiness. I'm happy to be happy from time to time. It's made me happy to be with you today. Yeah, and happiness illumines things. You know, it's the lightness of the spirit at time that we need to remember. In the darkest of times, the spirit can prevail, and that can make you happy, even when things are miserable around you. So we're never fully alone. We're never without resources. We're never without some deep presence that wishes to support us through this journey. And if you remember that, that will keep you happy at moments when times are very, very difficult.
James, obrigado. Eu, no nome do Tiaços, junto com a Luciana, junto com a Isa, queremos te agradecer muito. Que você tenha uma bela recuperação, que você possa se recuperar de toda essa jornada de dor que você teve. Conte conosco, conte com o nosso apoio, com o nosso suporte. É uma imensa, eu vou me repetir, mas é uma imensa alegria, honra e satisfação te receber. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Thank you. Thank you.
Espero que possamos nos ver pessoalmente em breve. Te deixo um grande abraço.
All right. Be well.
Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Tivemos hoje 250 pessoas aqui, número excelente para o Tiaços. Isa, querida, obrigado pela sua suavidade costumeira, sua forma absolutamente delicada de acompanhar essas palavras. Lu, pela parceria. Próximo encontro do Tiaços é Lu.
Semana que vem, Gustavo Beck, Fracasso, Análise e Justiça, Reflexões Psicológicas, Socioeconômicas e Políticas sobre a Identidade Junguiana.
Muito obrigado, pessoal. Espero que a felicidade corra atrás de vocês e que a gente possa fazer alguma coisa de boa com ela.
Deixa eu só
Tá
falar
bom?
uma coisinha para o James. Eu acho que
Diga,
todos
Lu.
nós tivemos momentos tão felizes aqui, não é à toa que tivemos muitas mensagens no chat dizendo que podiam ouvi-lo por horas.
Thank you.
Obrigado, pessoal. Bom fim de semana. Até a próxima. Até lá.
Obrigado, Marcos. Obrigado, equipe aí.